Today I'm going to be focusing on part of my PhD research, which is focused on the late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age of Crete. I'm working on an archaeological synthesis that covers the period from the last Minoan palaces through to the emergence of the later Greek city-states, a period which has historically sat uncomfortably between the concerns of Aegean prehistorians and classical archaeologists and was formerly dubbed the Greek Dark Ages. Today I'm only going to focus on a part of that broader picture and a major debate surrounding settlement patterns at the end of the Bronze Age around 1200 BCE to illustrate the ways in which GIS approaches can be brought to bear on questions around changing human occupation and organization within the landscape. To set the scene a little, the Neo-Palatial period, as it's called, or Middle Minoan III to Late Minoan I, was the high point of Cretan palatial society with several palaces across the island, each with diverse political, administrative and religious functions, overseeing production of a range of crafts and consumables. All but one of these were destroyed towards the end of that period, and only the palace at Knossos continued into the final palatial period, Late Minoan IIIa to B, perhaps now under the control of groups from mainland Greece. Interestingly, the eastern third of the island, including the area I'll be talking about today, seems to have been unintegrated into that territory of the palace, and Knossos, along with the possible second palace in West Crete, was destroyed towards the end of this period, and that was the end of state-level administration on Crete for several hundred years. These destructions form part of a wider phenomenon known as the Late Bronze Age collapse, which saw many contemporary state societies in the Eastern Mediterranean disrupted or destroyed. Explanations for this range from earthquakes and droughts to civil unrest and economic decentralization, but a particularly popular theory centers on the so-called Sea Peoples, a mysterious collection of ocean-going pirates and raiders depicted particularly in Egyptian texts and iconography. So some would see these Sea Peoples as responsible for the destructions, while others believe they're more an object of Egyptian propaganda, at most a reflection of an unstable time where populations were more mobile and trading and raiding were somewhat conflated. At this time on Crete, many sites, particularly lower lying and coastal sites, are abandoned and new ones are founded in upland, defensive, remote locations. And the debate is over whether these movements were a result of threats like the Sea Peoples, forcing people to seek shelter inland, or else local social, political, and subsistence concerns, with communities now lacking state-level governance, seeking security through defensible locations and groups of connected villages. Now, well-excavated settlements of this period are relatively few, but through intensive survey and particularly prospection by dedicated researchers like Krzysztof Nowicki, we know of the existence of many sites across the island at this time, particularly in these defensible locations. So given this situation, I believe the thoughtful application of GIS methods has much to offer our understanding. To illustrate, I'd like to present a case study concerning the Bay of Mirabello and the Isthmus of Arepetra, which is the island's narrowest point. The area is central to debates around these so-called refuge sites, as a number of them have been identified through surveying the area and several actually excavated. No fewer than 3 archaeological surveys have been conducted in this region in the 1980s and 90s, the Cavusi survey to the east, Vrocastro to the west, and Gornia in the center. Now, importantly, these covered the same periods, defined sites in the same kind of ways, and so have produced data that are conducive to an integrated GIS analysis. Now, some sites worth mentioning in advance to hold in your mind are Gornia, which was an important Minoan settlement, the preeminent one in the region until its abandonment in the late 13th century. Vrocastro, which was founded around 1200 BC, one of these potential refuge settlements, but quite close to the coast. Azoria to the east, founded around the same time, and this grew into a large town several hundred years later. Cavusi Castro is on a hill above Azoria. It was the place where that picture at the start was taken from, looking down on Azoria. And interestingly, this hilltop site, there's a third site in this cluster, Cavusi Vronda. Interestingly, the hilltop site was occupied for longer. This lower lying site was actually abandoned, suggesting these hilltop settlements weren't just a response to desperate circumstances that were soon abandoned when they could be. However, finally, these 2 sites very close to each other, Monasteraki, Katalimata, and Chalasmenos, the one above Katalimata is right on the edge of this gorge, a very precipitous site, and it is abandoned, seemingly with the population moving to this slightly more accessible Menos site lower down. So in analysing the settlement patterns of this region, I want to discuss 4 methods: logistic regression analyses, pair correlation functions, visibility analysis, and least cost path networks. So bear with me here, we'll get through this together. Logistic regression aims at identifying environmental variables which most influence settlement location in a given period. You begin with a set of maps which represent such environmental variables that you think might be significant. And then what you do is, within the area of every site identified in the survey, you drop a number of points randomly, proportionate to the size of the site, and give these the values of the environmental variables at that location. You then compare these points to a random sample of points in the wider landscape, or points from other sites and other periods, to look for which variables act as good predictors of site presence in the chosen period. And what you end up with after 1,000 iterations of that is a graph like this, where positive and negative correlations are shown on the y-axis, each of the variables is shown on the x-axis, and the proportion of the 1,000 iterations in which each variable was selected as significant is shown at the top, with the darker ones being the strongest correlations. So pair correlation functions take these environmental variables that we identified as significant, and they examine whether, given those constraints, sites nonetheless cluster or disperse more than you would expect, again, given those environmental variables. So this is done by identifying sites in increasing bands around every site point, and it produces a graph that looks like this. The light gray zone represents what a random distribution would look like, and the dark gray zone is the actual signal. Moving left to right on the x-axis are longer distances, larger scales. And so the red and blue areas represent scales where sites are dispersed or aggregated relative to what you would expect. And this hopefully should be telling us something about social factors influencing site placement. In visibility analysis, lines of sight are drawn between every point, and given an elevation map, the algorithm can work out which lines of sight are blocked and which are clear, and this produces a map of a network of intervisible sites. And then finally, with least cost path analysis, you're trying to identify the least costly route through a landscape based on what's called a cost surface, where every pixel represents an incurred cost. So my cost surface is made by combining a slope map and a map of current land use, land cover values. These are combined, and then an algorithm moves from each point across every pixel in the landscape, registering its cost, and then calculates the cheapest route between those points. You add this all up between all of your points, and you get a network that shows you the most frequently used paths through a landscape. So methods out the way, turning to the data, what do we see? Well, in the Neopalatial period, there's dense occupation of the lower lying valleys in the region, probably linked to high population, extensive agricultural production within the context of palatial oversight. Now, there's a widespread depopulation of the area in the subsequent late Minoan 3A to B period, probably following those destructions that left only Knossos, the still functioning palace. And remember, this region is probably outside of its control at this time. And finally, in the late Minoan 3C, we see the emergence of these upland settlement clusters around Vrocastro, Kavusi, Monastiraki, and a pattern that looks quite different from the preceding periods. So though the number of sites declines through each of these successive periods, we actually see a growth in the total settled area from 3A and B into 3C. In other words, the sites may have been founded in more remote locations, but they were not necessarily more marginal or transient than those which preceded them. And also of note is that 82% of all the 3A to B sites are just continuing occupation from the previous period, suggesting that population was thinning out, but the fundamentals of settlement location maybe didn't change all that much. And then into the subsequent period, there's a much greater turnover in settlement, suggesting a more significant reorientation of occupation in the landscape. Now, turning to the logistic regressions, remember the environmental variables that might be significant. This is against the wider landscape random site point samples. What we see is that the Neopalatial and final palatial periods give very similar signals. Both show low elevation, both show a slight tendency to settle on ridges, good short-term visibility, less good long-distance visibility. And this all probably pertains to the occupation of those lower lying valleys and the good agricultural land there. Further evidence in their similarities that despite the significant depopulation that occurred, the general character of settlement seems to have been the same. The contrast in LM3C is that we get very low flatland and topographic wetness values, and that's basically means soil moisture, and high distances from the coast. Now, this is exactly what we'd expect given these sites are inland, up high, and the land is probably more rugged and less well watered. And there's reduced short scale visibility, but better offshore visibility, i.e. they can see the sea better. And all of this might tie into the narrative I laid out at the start with these communities cautious of seaborne threats. Now, turning to the results that we get when we compare sites to each other from different periods, we see that the Neopalatial period does very well for flat land and topographic wetness, those variables that correlate well with agricultural land. And actually compared to other sites, it seems to have relatively good long distance visibility. The LM3A signal is not very clear. We've got a slight tendency towards channels and ridges, but otherwise not many good variables that we can rely on. The LM3C pattern is much clearer. Again, low flatland values and wetness values and high distances from the coast. In other words, the same variables are showing up again, and this all suggests that these are strong indicators of the underlying motivations for the founders of these settlements. Looking at site clustering and dispersion, we see that in the Neopalatial period, there was actually a relatively random distribution of sites, i.e. It may be the types of land and not the relationships between settlements which most influence their distribution. The 3A to B settlement pattern is unclear again, but then in 3C, we see this very clear distinction between local clustering and more distant dispersion, something intuitively visible in the map, but significantly it lends credence to the theory that the clustering of sites was an active strategy on the part of these communities. Turning to visibility, we see dense networks of intervisibility in the Neopalatial period, thinning out in that period of depopulation. And then what we see is that these site clusters are not only nearby, they are also very intervisible. And we're starting to get a sense now that these sites are founded in these networks for quite conscious reasons, not just a simple dispersion from the coast. There seems to be planning going into the founding of these settlements. Looking at paths, so movement through the landscape, we see that there was a dense network again in the Neopalatial period, with the site of Gornia there on the coastline occupying the main east-west route. That continues to some extent into the next period, but then we see an attenuation of that network into LM3C. The important thing to note here, though, is that a lot of the same routes are probably continuing throughout this period, i.e. the lowlands are probably still being used by these communities moving between different sites, even though they're now settled in different parts of the landscape. Agriculture and exchange and marriage and religious rituals would have seen these people still moving between their settlements. And a good example here is, I'll touch briefly on agricultural catchments. This is an estimate of the agricultural area for the Kavusi settlements, which you can see here maps on very nicely to the modern limits of agriculture. But the point is essentially that they would have still had to cultivate the low-lying plains, even though they were now living at higher elevations. And finally, if we look at movement, not between sites, but across the landscape, we drop random points either side of the isthmus and we model the paths across it, we see that Gornia was an important point in an east-west route across the isthmus there. But into the LM3C periods, look how the settlement clusters are founded on important routes through the landscape. And moving forward, if we look ahead to the emergence of the later city-states in this area, they again are focused on these important pinch points, major routes that cross the area. And the question that gets raised there is, would a community set its sights would a community set on avoiding detection from the coasts and nothing else locate on such important strategic access routes in the landscape? So to finish then, I hope I've outlined how some of these GIS methods can prove informative for our discussions at the end of the Bronze Age and the founding of these so-called refuge sites. They do tend to be further from the coast and more remote, and their founders clearly took a hit when it came to accessible agricultural land, but they were not only remote, but also commanding locations. We have seen how they cluster in intervisible groups far from other settlements, and in several cases overlooked important routes through the landscape, where larger settlements later developed. Their inhabitants would have continued to frequent the lowlands for a host of reasons, meaning knowledge of routes and good land, stories and myths set in the landscape, and real or imagined ties to ancestral settlements would have remained alive within the communities. To me, this suggests that local threats and pressures and negotiations over territory, land, power, community, movement, access, etc., were all just as significant, if not more so, than threats from the sea in shaping settlement in this period. Sorry. Thank you very much.